The city hummed with life as Mohamed Salah stepped out of his car and into the cool evening air. It had been a long day, training sessions, meetings, the usual routine of a top athlete. His body ached slightly, but it was the kind of exhaustion he welcomed, the kind that told him he had given his all. Now all he wanted was a quiet meal, a moment to himself before another relentless schedule began. The restaurant's golden glow spilled onto the sidewalk, a warm contrast to the crisp night outside. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was one he had invested in, though very few people knew that. He preferred it that way. Salah never liked throwing his weight around, never enjoyed the way people's attitudes changed the moment they recognized his name. He wasn't here as a football star, as Liverpool's talisman, or as Egypt's pride. Tonight, he was just a man looking for a good meal. He stepped inside, the comforting aroma of grilled meats and fresh herbs filling the air. The restaurant was bustling, packed with diners engaged in quiet conversations, laughter bubbling from a few tables. It was the kind of place where people came to enjoy not just the food, but the atmosphere, a balance of sophistication and warmth. Salah kept his head down, slipping through the room unnoticed. He had mastered the art of blending in when he wanted to. No flashy designer brands tonight, just a plain sweater and jeans. No entourage, no security, just himself. He scanned the room briefly, spotting an empty table in the corner near the window. Perfect. As he moved toward it, he caught a glimpse of the staff moving swiftly between tables, trays balanced with practiced ease. The waiters wore matching uniforms, crisp white shirts, and black aprons. They carried themselves with the air of professionals, but one stood out. A young man with sharp features and an air of arrogance that clung to him like expensive cologne. Salah didn't think much of it. Not yet. He slid into his seat, exhaling quietly as he picked up the menu. He already knew what he wanted, but there was something peaceful about the ritual of looking through the options anyway. For the first time in hours, he felt his shoulders relax. He had no idea the night was about to take an unexpected turn. The murmur of conversations and the rhythmic clinking of cutlery filled the air, a familiar symphony of a thriving restaurant. Salah sat quietly in the corner, his posture relaxed but observant. He had chosen this spot deliberately, out of the way, where he could enjoy his meal undisturbed. The city outside buzzed with life beyond the large glass windows, but in here, the warmth of the dim lighting and the inviting aroma of fresh dishes created a world of its own. A few tables away, a waiter weaved through the room with an air of self-importance. Jason, young and sharp-featured, carried himself like a man who believed he ran the place. He moved with forced precision, flicking glances at tables with an expression that made it clear which guests he deemed important and which ones he saw as an inconvenience. His eyes landed on Salah, and almost instantly his expression shifted. Dressed simply, alone, with no air of wealth or status surrounding him, Salah looked, at least to Jason, like another ordinary customer taking up space in his high-end establishment. Jason sighed through his nose, adjusting his apron as he made his way over. Stopping beside the table, he barely spared Salah a glance. "You looking for someone?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. Salah looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no recognition, no hint of respect in Jason's gaze, just irritation. "No," Salah said evenly. "I'd like to order." Jason exhaled sharply, shifting his weight to one side. "We're a bit busy right now. Might take a while," he said, glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere better to be. Salah didn't react. He had experienced this before. The subtle dismissiveness, the quiet underestimation. It had happened when he was younger, when people thought he was just another kid with dreams too big for his reality. It still happened now, in different ways, from different people. "I don't mind waiting," Salah said, his voice calm, steady. Jason let out a small, condescending chuckle. "Suit yourself." With that, he walked away, shaking his head slightly, as if annoyed that he had to waste his time on someone so unimportant. Salah turned his gaze back to the menu, but he wasn't reading anymore. He had already seen everything he needed to. Jason returned after what felt like an unnecessarily long time, carrying nothing but an impatient scowl. He stood over the table, barely looking at Salah as he pulled out a small notepad, tapping the edge of his pen against it with an air of forced tolerance. You ready to order, or do you need more time? His tone wasn't friendly, it wasn't even neutral. It was the kind of voice used for someone wasting his time, someone who didn't belong. Salah set the menu down gently. I'll have the grilled lamb, he said. Jason raised an eyebrow. You sure? It's one of our more premium dishes. Salah met his eyes, but Jason was already smirking to himself. Maybe I should suggest something else. Something more reasonable? Jason added, his voice dripping with condescension. The words weren't direct, but the implication hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Salah had heard it before in different variations. The assumption, the judgment, the belief that people like him didn't belong in places like this. Jason let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly. Look, I don't want to waste my time if you… Grilled lamb, Salah repeated, his voice calm, unwavering. Medium rare. Jason pressed his lips together, looking like he wanted to argue, but instead scribbled the order down with an exaggerated sigh. Other guests nearby had started to notice. A couple sitting 2 tables over exchanged glances, the woman subtly nudging her partner as if to say, Are you hearing this? Another man across the room frowned slightly, watching the exchange in quiet discomfort. But no one said anything. Jason, oblivious or perhaps enjoying his own performance, wasn't done yet. Would you like a drink with that? He asked, his voice flat. Water's fine, Salah replied. Jason snorted under his breath. Of course it is, he muttered, just loud enough for Salah to hear. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. Salah exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the table. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But there was something almost fascinating about people like Jason. People who mistook arrogance for authority, who believed they could decide who deserved respect and who didn't. They never realized, not until it was too late, how wrong they were. The air in the restaurant had shifted. The tension wasn't loud, but it was there, a quiet, pressing weight that settled over the surrounding tables. A few diners had noticed the way Jason spoke to Salah, the clipped tone, the arrogance thinly veiled behind forced politeness. No one had intervened, but the discomfort in their glances was growing. From across the room, the restaurant manager, a man in his late 40s with a sharp eye for customer service, caught the unease in the air. Years of experience had given him a sixth sense for trouble, and something about the way Jason moved between tables, calm with some, dismissive with others, set off a quiet alarm in his mind. He moved toward the scene, approaching Jason just as he was about to walk past him. Everything all right here? The manager asked, his voice neutral but firm. Jason barely faltered. Yeah, all good, he said casually, barely turning his head. Just taking orders. The manager's gaze shifted toward Salah, whose expression remained unreadable. Salah could have spoken up. He could have pointed out the disrespect, the unnecessary hostility, the way Jason had carried himself with an air of superiority. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he offered a polite smile and said, Actually, I was about to ask, what's the best dish on the menu? Jason paused for a fraction of a second. The corner of his mouth curled slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. He saw his chance. Well, he said, dragging out the word, our real signature dish is the Wagyu steak. It's imported, premium cut, aged to perfection. It's also our most expensive item, so… He trailed off, shrugging as if to suggest maybe it's out of your league. Salah held his gaze, letting the moment stretch just long enough for Jason to feel the weight of his silence. Then, with the same calm tone, he said, Sounds perfect. I'll have that. Jason's smirk faltered. He blinked, hesitating for just a beat too long before scoffing under his breath. Sure thing, he muttered, scribbling it down with a bit too much force. The manager watched the exchange carefully, suspicion creeping into his features. But Salah? He simply leaned back, folded his hands, and waited. Because people like Jason always revealed themselves in time. The steak arrived, perfectly plated, the aroma of seared Wagyu filling the air. The presentation was flawless. Every detail meticulously arranged, the kind of dish meant for customers who expected nothing less than excellence. But Jason barely acknowledged it as he placed the plate down with a muted thud, offering no pleasantries, no smile, not even a, enjoy your meal. He simply turned and walked away, convinced he had made his point. Salah, however, remained unbothered. He picked up his knife and fork with practiced ease, slicing into the tender meat, the first bite melting in his mouth. He chewed slowly, savoring the rich flavors, undistracted by the hostility he had endured since stepping into the restaurant. If Jason had expected frustration, expected some kind of reaction, he would find none. Salah was a man who had faced stadiums full of screaming opposition, last-minute game-deciding penalties, the weight of an entire country's expectations. A rude waiter was nothing. From across the room, a few waiters whispered amongst themselves. One of them, a young woman clearing a nearby table, had been watching carefully since Jason first approached Salah. She nudged her colleague, a man in his 30s who had been with the restaurant for years. "That's him, isn't it?" she murmured, keeping her voice low. The older waiter followed her gaze, recognition dawning in his expression. "Yeah," he said, almost in disbelief. "That's Mohamed Salah." They exchanged glances, both realizing the weight of the moment. Salah wasn't just another wealthy diner, wasn't just someone who could afford the most expensive dish on the menu. He was the co-owner of the very restaurant Jason had been treating him like an outsider in. The whispers grew, subtle but spreading, weaving through the restaurant like a quiet storm. Some staff members exchanged knowing looks, others simply watched in uneasy silence. Jason, oblivious, continued his shift with smug confidence. He had won, at least in his own mind. But Salah wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to make an impact. No, he was simply waiting for the right moment. The murmurs among the staff grew, threading through the restaurant like a quiet ripple before a storm. A senior waiter, a man who had worked in hospitality long enough to recognize faces that mattered, felt his stomach drop the moment he locked eyes with Salah. He had seen him on screens, in headlines, lifting trophies, scoring impossible goals. And now, here he was, seated humbly in a corner, eating in silence while one of their own treated him like a nobody. He didn't hesitate. Spinning on his heel, he strode toward the manager's station, his voice hushed but urgent. "Boss, we have a problem," he murmured. The restaurant manager barely looked up from his clipboard. "We're at full capacity. If it's a customer complaint, handle it." The waiter leaned in. "It's Mohamed Salah." The words landed like a blow. The manager's fingers tightened around the clipboard as his head snapped up. His face paled. "Where?" His voice was no longer distracted, no longer indifferent. The waiter jerked his chin toward the corner table. The manager followed his gaze and spotted him instantly. The unmistakable profile, the composed posture, the effortless way he carried himself. And then his eyes flicked toward Jason, the young, arrogant waiter, still oblivious, still strutting through the restaurant as if he owned the place. A quiet curse left the manager's lips. Without wasting another second, he moved, weaving through tables with the urgency of a man trying to undo a disaster before it could fully unfold. As he reached Salah's table, his expression was already shifting into an apology. "Mr. Salah," he started, voice low, respectful. But before he could finish, Salah lifted a hand, a small, effortless gesture that stopped him mid-sentence. His expression was calm, unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of irritation, just quiet observation. The manager hesitated, confused. Salah wasn't dismissing him. He wasn't even acknowledging the insult. He was watching, waiting, and that was far more unsettling than an outburst ever could be. Jason moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that the air had shifted, that quiet eyes were now watching him with something between disbelief and dread. He had no idea that his manager was standing, just a few feet away, frozen in attention-laced silence, too stunned to act. He was still convinced he was winning. As he passed by Salah's table again, he caught sight of him holding his phone, snapping a quick photo of his meal. Jason smirked, rolling his eyes as he slowed his pace. "Gonna post it like a wannabe influencer?" he sneered, folding his arms as if waiting for a reaction. For the first time that evening, Salah finally looked up. The moment their eyes met, the entire energy in the room shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Jason's smirk faltered, just slightly. The easy arrogance he had been carrying all night wavered under the weight of Salah's gaze. There was no anger in those dark eyes, no irritation, just quiet, unsettling calm. A silence settled over the surrounding tables. The low murmur of conversations dimmed, as if the restaurant itself sensed something had changed. Jason swallowed, suddenly aware that the moment was stretching too long, that he was standing there without speaking, that something was wrong. But he wasn't the type to back down. He forced his smirk back into place. "Just saying," he muttered, shifting his weight. "Some people like to pretend they belong in places like this." Salah didn't blink. Jason shifted again. The silence was unbearable now, suffocating in a way he didn't understand. And then Salah spoke. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Do you treat all your customers like this?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. And somewhere, deep in his gut, a small, creeping fear began to take root. Jason let out a short, breathy laugh, shaking his head as if Salah had just asked the dumbest question in the world. "Do I treat all my customers like this?" he repeated, still clinging to the confidence that was slipping through his fingers. "No, just the ones who—" "Jason." The voice cut through the air like a blade. Jason turned, the smirk still lingering on his lips, but it faltered when he saw his manager standing just a few feet away. The older man's face was pale, his jaw tight, and his eyes carried something Jason had never seen directed at him before. Fear. The shift in the restaurant was palpable. Conversations had died down completely. Forks hovered above plates, glasses were set down mid-sip. Even the waitstaff stood frozen, eyes darting between Jason and Salah, between ignorance and realization. The manager took a slow step forward, his voice lower this time, each word measured, deliberate. "Do you know who you've been speaking to?" Jason scoffed, crossing his arms. "I don't know, some guy who thinks—" "That," the manager interrupted, his voice dangerously controlled, "is Mohamed Salah." Jason blinked. The words didn't register at first, bouncing off the wall of his own arrogance. But then, like a slow-moving tidal wave, they crashed over him. His lips parted slightly, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and horror. "And," the manager continued, letting the silence hang for just a moment longer, "he's not just a customer. He's the co-owner of this restaurant." Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. The smirk was gone. The confidence drained from his face like color from a fading photograph. He turned back to Salah as if hoping to find some kind of lifeline in his expression. But Salah hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't needed to. He simply watched. And in that moment, Jason realized he had made the worst mistake of his career. Jason's mouth opened, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had been so sure of himself just minutes ago, so convinced he had been in control of the situation. But now, as the weight of reality settled over him like a crushing force, he could barely breathe. I was just joking," he stammered, his voice weak, barely above a whisper. No one believed him. Not the staff, who had watched the way he had treated Salah from the start. Not the guests, who had heard every condescending remark. And certainly not the manager, whose face remained a mask of controlled fury. Salah tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, the quiet power in his eyes making Jason feel small, exposed. "You were joking," Salah repeated, his voice calm, steady. Jason swallowed hard, nodding too quickly. "Yeah, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just messing around, having a little fun." A slow silence spread through the room, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words to be understood. Then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Salah leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was soft, but it carried through the room with undeniable weight. "Respect," he said, "isn't about who someone is. It's about who you are." Jason felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Salah turned his gaze to the manager, effortlessly shifting the focus away from Jason's crumbling facade. "Tell me," he asked, his voice even, "what's our policy on how customers should be treated?" The manager, who had been standing stiff as a statue, straightened his spine. His voice was clear, strong, unshaken. With dignity and respect, he answered. Salah nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then let's make sure it applies to everyone. Jason's stomach twisted. He had spent the whole night looking down on a man who had been above him the entire time, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Jason stood frozen, his world unraveling in slow motion. The heat of humiliation crawled up his neck, burning into his skin. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the restaurant, each one silently condemning him, stripping away the false confidence he had carried all night. He wanted to disappear, to escape the suffocating silence pressing down on him. But there was no way out. Not this time. Salah could have ended it right there. He had every right to demand Jason's immediate dismissal, to make an example out of him. A single word from him and Jason would be gone. Escorted out? Just another name in a long list of employees who had lost their jobs for less. But Salah didn't do that. Instead, he leaned back, his expression unreadable. You have a choice, he said, his voice calm but firm. You can leave if that's what you want. Walk away, pretend this never happened. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He already knew what came next. Or, Salah continued, his gaze never wavering, you can stay. Prove that you've learned something tonight. Treat every guest with the respect they deserve. Not because of their status, not because of what they can afford, but because it's the right thing to do. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. He had expected punishment. He had braced for consequences, but this was worse. Because it demanded change. It demanded that he confront the kind of person he had been. His throat felt dry as he swallowed hard. His voice faltered, cracking under the weight of everything. I want to stay. Salah studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Then prove it. Jason exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening just slightly. He wasn't sure what redemption looked like, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't waste this chance. As Salah rose from his seat, a quiet shift moved through the restaurant. The customers who had been silent observers now looked at him with something different. Respect. Not just as a footballer, not just as a man of success, but as a man of character. The lesson wasn't just for Jason, it was for everyone.